Good evening. I'm Mitch Horowitz, and thank you for joining us for this presentation on the state of the occult 2022. We're heading toward a new year, and the question that I will approach in this evening's talk is whether we are also heading towards some sort of a new epoch or era in the human understanding of spirituality, by which I mean the extraphysical. I would have hesitated to deliver a talk like this as recently as 2 years ago. I think I have probably spent my entire career as a historian and a writer on alternative spirituality, as a participant in many of the spiritual and esoteric ideas, practices, and methods that I write about, both in history and in technique. I think I've spent most of my career probably telling journalists at one time or another that I didn't think that we were necessarily in the stage of a new occult revival. And I should make my terms clear. By occult, I'm using the classical term that derives from Latin occultus or occulta, which originally meant hidden or secret, and which during the Renaissance came to refer to the pre-Christian spirituality of the ancient world in Greece, Rome, Persia, Egypt, throughout the Mediterranean basin. The Western world had, of course, a very wide range of initiatory traditions, mystery religions steeped in deity worship, prophecy, divination, sacred geometry, number symbolism, the wish to consort with greater forces, higher intelligences, unseen entities, spirits, and all of this, which was a fundamental part of human history for millennia, vanished to a very great extent during the advent of Christianity, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the later period of the early medieval era, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. So when Renaissance scholars were rediscovering all this material, it was, in fact, part of an unseen, lost antique world. It was a secret doctrine, a cosmological system that drew upon sources as diverse as Hermeticism, alchemy, different variants of Mesopotamian and Hellenic astrology, and it had vanished. Its temple orders, its priesthoods were gone. Its core texts destroyed or sometimes relegated to a certain safety in monasteries or other places where there was some degree of stability during centuries of upheaval. So when I use occult, I'm speaking in classical terms of that ancient spirituality that humanity rediscovered in fragments during the Renaissance era and beyond. And we continue today to try to get in touch with the presence, the existence of a primeval spirituality, one that belongs to no doctrine, no dogma, no congregation, around which there are no walls or parameters other than the wish to search. So that is my reference when I speak of the occult. When I speak of the spiritual, I speak of the extraphysical, the possibility that the human being has a life that goes beyond cognition and motor skill, that we belong to some greater sense of possibilities and infinitude, which the ancient Greeks used to refer to at times as a nous, or a greater higher mind, which they saw as the creative agency of all that is, and of which we are parts, almost as capillaries. And within our framework, we can, in our own way, create as this greater mind creates, as above, so below, went the Hermetic dictum. So the question is, we in the 21st century, as we approach this new year of 2022, feel, I think quite rightly, as though we are turning a page. We're coming out of a lockdown, or at least I hope we're coming out of a lockdown. People are asking new questions about jobs, finance, career, selfhood, purpose, the integrity of their own minds and wishes and needs, the nature of their own ability to shape their existence rather than having it continually shaped for them by all kinds of various machinations and forces which can leave us feeling adrift from time to time. But as I mentioned, in previous years, including until very recently, and over the span of my career as a historian and writer on alternative spirituality, I rejected the question of a new occult revival. I thought it came too easily to the lips. I thought, well, look, every generation feels like it's on some sort of a precipice. And to be honest, I grew weary at times of hearing the suppositions of journalists or others in media, usually timed to Halloween, that economic anxiety or anxiety over social status or new developments in technology were somehow responsible for a renewed interest in the occult, whereas I would point out interest in the occult has largely been an evergreen in the modern world. Going back to the authentic occult revival that Madame H.P. Blavatsky and Madame Blavatsky's co-founders of the Theosophical Society in 1875, along with others, and along with earlier important steps, such as the thought of figures like P.B. Randolph or Eliphas Levi, that occult revival of the late 19th century was seismically powerful and important. It influenced the arts, politics, culture, science. It influenced how we as human beings conceived of ourselves, as much as Darwinism did, I would say. I think it's fair to say another occult revival during the Woodstock generation, where a renewed search for the numinous filled people with enthusiasm that there were possibilities in human awareness and possibilities that could be discovered about your mind, its causative faculties, prospects of cleansing the doors of perception, as William Blake put it, the possibilities that entheogens and psychedelics, psilocybin, and other substances could have mind-expanding properties, encounters with philosophies of the East on a mass scale from Zen to yoga that drove the 60s and 70s generation to feel like there were all kinds of doorways and opportunities that opened to spiritual experience without being wed to one doctrine or congregation or another, which, as referenced earlier, is a pretty good, sturdy definition of what we can consider occult or esoteric spirituality in our time. But following those waves of the late 19th century and of the 60s generation, I tended to feel like, to a great extent, our generation had received most of the key ideas. We weren't living in an age of great or iconic teachers by and large. Group encounters, to a very significant extent, at least in my estimation, had replaced the teacher-student transmission. Perhaps replaced is the wrong word, but again, the point I'm trying to make is that ours has been an age without great iconic teachers on the scale of a Rudolf Steiner or a G.I. Gurdjieff or a Madame H.P. Blavatsky or a Carl Jung. I think the group encounter, in terms of meaning and transmission, has, for a time, supplanted the age of great teachers. So that aside, I still really resisted talk of new epochs, occult revivals, a third wave occult revival. I felt all that stuff was hasty. And again, every generation, sometimes with cause, seems to feel that it exists on a kind of a precipice. Every generation feels like it's passing from one threshold to another. And in some cases, that's with considerable justification. As much as our era, one of very serious climate change, environmental stakes, a worldwide pandemic, technology that we're not quite sure how to assess or where it's going, questions around AI. As seismic as these questions are, imagine yourself living in the era around World War I or World War II, or the Russian Civil War. You would feel experiences that would possibly even feel more devastatingly upending than what we're going through today. It's just a piece of perspective I want to keep in mind. It's not to minimize the severity of today's questions, but I think we can understand that there have been generations in other parts of the world that have felt all the touchstones of life vanish in their time. I don't think we've had quite that. At the same time, I feel prepared to say, at least from my own perspective as a seeker, and I only speak from my perspective as a seeker, that's the only title I'll ever claim. You and I are co-seekers. I feel from my perspective as a seeker, there is a new opening to the numinous in our culture today. There are new things happening with serious implications for all of us who consider ourselves searchers, all of us who consider ourselves people on the path, and other people who may not regard themselves as seekers in any sense, but who I think in our time are experiencing an expanded perspective on human nature. To some extent, this involves a field that does not necessarily intersect with the occult. It's indirect. And that is the study of UFOs. I think we're seeing an extraordinary turn of a page right now at this instant with respect to UFOs, which is that the UFO question has gone mainstream. That's been underway for a couple of years. It's been underway going back to around 2019 when Navy cockpit videos that had already been leaked were validated. And in the march of months since then, other military material that was leaked has since been validated as authentic, and the Department of Defense has released a report of some 150, close to 150 sightings, for which it has said, we have no explanation. We're viewing a technology that is not presently understood within our current paradigm. And figures including Barack Obama have on television said, yes, we have encountered and recorded things on high-def video, on radar, using impeccable media for which we have no explanation. And this is a change. This is a cultural change. When I was a little kid, if you brought up UFOs, there was a 50-50 chance that somebody would say, oh, swamp gas, weather balloons, delusion, fake, little green men. The question would very often get sideswiped, and that would be that. But we live in an era in which no serious person dismisses the UFO thesis. I recall some of this unfolding in the summer of 2019, where there was a panel on UFOs convened at the Guggenheim Museum here in New York City, where I'm speaking from. And the Guggenheim is not a fount of occult passions, but they had just hosted a very, very successful exhibit of the paintings of an artist with a theosophical background, Hilma Afklimt. And the exhibit all but broke records. People came in huge number, and they were looking at what were essentially thought forms, to use the term of the book that Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater authored in the early 20th century, a book in which they used what they considered to be trance-based clairvoyant perceptions to describe images and paintings to artists who themselves form the germination of abstract art. It was an incredible statement, and Hilma Afklimt created magnificent paintings that could likewise be grouped under the rubric of these thought forms. They were inner visions, intercosmological visions, and that the exhibit had been so successful cracked open the door to further experimentations. Again, not things that were necessarily one and the same as the occult or the esoteric, but this UFO panel, which was convened by Troy Therian, a very gifted curator. He was the same person who curated the Afklimt exhibit, and I thought he did a wonderful thing by convening a panel to discuss the modern UFO question. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, "Let me ask you a question. At what point in our culture do you think it's going to become intellectually embarrassing for someone to wave off and dismiss the question of UFOs?" And I said to him at that time, in the summer of 2019, right now. Literally, we're living through that instant at this moment. No serious person today could dismiss the UFO question. And what's important about this, from my perspective, as a seeker, may be important to you too, is that, again, it opens us to the numinous, because the fact is, in probing the question of what UFOs are, nothing can be taken off the table. You know, maybe there is some form of earthly technology that we haven't grappled with yet. You know, nothing can be taken off the table. It's critical that whether one's sympathies lay in the direction of being a seeker, whether one's sympathies lay in the direction of seeing oneself as a skeptic or a materialist, materialism being the philosophy that matter essentially creates itself. You know, we live in a physically measurable empirical world where the known elements are reality. Wherever one sees oneself on that scale, don't take anything off the table. Now, my friend Jacques Vallée, one of the most distinguished UFO researchers living today, and a great intellect, a venture capitalist, and someone who also participated in the critical early research that developed the internet, Jacques made the case going back to the late 1960s that, in effect, if you use the principle of Occam's razor, whereby the simplest answer that covers the greatest number of bases is likely to be right, it's actually easier to explain the UFO phenomenon in terms of interdimensionality than it is in terms of interstellar travel. It's easier based on our current quantum models, based on our current theorizing about the possibility of parallel worlds, serial universes, interdimensionality. Some of this goes under the rubric of string theory, to which I'll return. It's easier to apply the theoretical model of interdimensionality to the appearance of craft that don't belong to our current conceptions of materiality than it is to explain physical craft traveling such vast, vast distances so as to be interstellar. And that's really something to consider. Because if we can arrive at a broader, effectively simpler explanation for the existence of realities that go outside of our current material framework, understanding, if we can explain that based on interdimensionality more easily, in a more graspable, in a more theoretically familiar way, then we can the ability of craft to travel such vast distances as would be required if we relied on an extraterrestrial thesis. It opens us to the numinous. It opens us to the question that this world that we see and that we exist in is the merest sliver of greater possibilities. Now, within quantum theory, for example, we have about 90 years of experiments that demonstrate to us that on a subatomic scale, objects exist in infinitude. They are everywhere at once until somebody makes a decision, until some sentient observer makes a decision to take a measurement, at which point a subatomic object collapses from a wave state, or an object that's in superposition in infinitude, into a particle state or a localized state in which an object is actually existent and occupying a certain place. And in short, if we have a situation in which infinitesimally small objects are occupying infinite position, and these objects become localized to your or my experience within our physical framework only at that moment in which measurement is taken, then it stands to reason that infinitude, serial possibilities, coexistent realities are not only suggested, but are necessary. The great physicist Erwin Schrödinger in his thought experiment Schrodinger's cat in 1935, derived a thought model which he intended to force quantum theorists to deal with the surreal implications of this data. And in the briefest of terms, Schrodinger described an experiment, or this is one variant of it, in which you might place a cat into one of two boxes. And this cat has around its neck what Schrodinger called a diabolical device, which, if it comes into contact with a single atom, would trip a poison that would kill the cat. So Schrodinger said, let's say you take your cat, you put it in one of two boxes, it has this device around its neck, which coming into contact with a single atom trips poison, kills the cat, and then you direct a single atom at the boxes. And then you go to check on which box the atom went into. Would you have a dead cat or a live cat? And of course, all common sense tells us is that if the atom went into the empty box, the cat would be alive. If the atom went into the box with the cat with the device around its neck, the cat would be dead. And Schrodinger said, wrong. You'd have a dead alive cat. You'd have to allow for both outcomes because interference patterns demonstrate that at one time, when in a wave state, that particle was in both boxes. It's an impossible reality that the implications of quantum physics data direct us towards. And it has to be lived with. It's the paradoxical truth. And in fact, later physicists theorized that if you were to wait some length of time before opening the boxes, say 8 hours, you would then open the box and have a dead cat and an alive cat that was now hungry and for which you had created a so-called past, present, and future because of the amount of time that passed, the interval, before an observer made the decision to go and look. This gave birth to what's called the many worlds theory. There were all kinds of outcomes coexistent and actual. And I said a so-called interval of time because since Einstein's theories of time and relativity, we know, and this has since been affirmed in different experiments, that time itself, we know intellectually, is not linear. Time slows down in environments of extreme speed or in environments of extreme gravity, like a black hole. The individual's actual experience of time changes apropos of an observer at some other point who's not moving at those extreme speeds or who's not experiencing extreme gravity. So that too brings us to the necessity of understanding time as an extremely useful, even necessary device for us 5 sensory beings. We need it. We need it to get through life. I have to know what time to show up here to deliver this talk, what time to stop. It's necessary, but it's illusory. It's not real. A law, by its very nature, is universal. Time is not a universal law. Relativity is a universal law. Time bends. Time changes. Quantum theory demonstrates to us that events, not just particles, but events are infinite, are simultaneous, are in a wave state, are limitless. We live in an infinitude of events and we experience the now, it seems to me, based on measurement. What is measurement? Well, our ordinary senses, which are coarse and which are limited and which see only the slenderest portion of what's actually going on. But maybe, when we experience things that we refer to as UFOs, or for that matter as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or ghosts or poltergeists or mysterious visitors or crisis apparitions or whatever term you want to use, maybe we are at certain moments gleaning events from some of these other serial outcomes or possibility. This is supported by some of the theories that are grouped under the rubric of string theory. One variant of string theory is that all of reality, all that is is connected from the most infinitesimal subatomic particle to entire universes along great networks of crisscrossing strings, which is why events tend to mirror one another, which is why a particle moving at a certain place in time and space affects another particle at great distances. And this is true of large objects, of macro objects as well. Objects that have no apparent gravitational affinity mirror one another at far distances. Isaac Newton himself made that observation. This has been validated on the macro scale as well as on the particle scale. And one of the theories grouped under string theory is the idea that all of reality, all these different simultaneous infinite events, entire universes, entire dimensions, are attached by this network of strings. And we will experience effects sometimes, such as the mirroring effect of events that go on elsewhere along this network of strings other than that framework which we occupy and have sensory awareness of. And sometimes these events may crisscross into our own realities. And the possibility of what's going on in these other realities is as infinite as the possibility suggested by the wave state of particles. It seems to me that once you crack open one door, you've cracked open all doors, in the same way that once you've closed one door, you've closed all doors. Because there's a ripple effect from everything. So the very fact that we're growing up, or we live in a world today, as we approach the year 2022, in which the UFO question has gone mainstream, is much bigger than the question of, well, what are these things? Itself an infinitely large question. But it's broader than that. Not only what are these things, but what are we? What are we? Because if you can have a serious discussion, and I don't see how it can be avoided, about the possibility of these things being interdimensional, well, that defines you as interdimensional. That defines you as a being whose psyche may be infinite, may be participating in all kinds of events going on throughout this vast network of strings occupied by vast networks of universes. This one prospect alone, and there are others, opens the door to so many questions about the makeup of human nature. Who are we? William Blake said, if you could cleanse the doors of perception, you'd be revealed to yourself as you really are. Infinite. The mystic, the poet, was prescient, was prophetic. In a sense, that's the threshold that we find ourselves perched upon at this moment. We're also experiencing new sensibilities of the efficacy and the powers of the mind. I mentioned earlier, that our senses, what are they? What are they but a kind of technology for measurement, an organic technology, to be sure, but a technology for measurement. They also evince a force. They evince a force, the field of neuroplasticity, a burgeoning field that's grown in popularity and been the subject of discourse for the past 20, 25 years. Neuroplasticity demonstrates through MRIs, through brain scans, that an individual's sustained thoughts eventually alter the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in the brain. And studies at UCLA and elsewhere have demonstrated repeatedly, and in data that is not controversial, that no one disputes, that if you hold a sustained pattern of thoughts, maybe redirecting your thoughts along more productive lines if you're plagued by ritualistic behaviors or other things that you're trying to resolve in your experience, sustained thoughts will actually alter the gray matter of the brain, will actually alter the brain at a cellular level, changing the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel. We're witnessing literally mind over matter on the neurological scale. And no one disputes this data. What's more difficult to come to terms with is the implications of the data. Brilliant research psychologist at UCLA, Jeffrey M. Schwartz, is one of the pioneers of the field of neuroplasticity, and he has made the statement very plainly, very bravely, very forthrightly that we have to start to come to terms with the implications of some of this data, which is, very simply put, mind over matter, and the discovery, on scientific terms, that thought evinces an actual physical force. I say on scientific terms because seekers have documented this same thing through testimony over the course of many centuries. But we're in an age right now where testimony and clinical data are intersecting, I would say, like never before. You wouldn't, the founders of the modern field of the placebo response, the field really took shape in its modern sense after the Second World War. They wouldn't even recognize the extraordinary strides that are being made today in placebo studies. We are seeing studies in which transparent placebos, transparently administered placebos, are generating a statistically significant and lasting healing response. We are seeing studies in which people are given accurate information about the aerobic and anaerobic benefits of their jobs, for example. And in response, their weight drops, their muscle mass, their muscle to fat ratio improves, their blood pressure drops, as compared with no changes whatsoever in control groups. In other words, just being given information or a transparent placebo is in and of itself sufficient to generate really existing physical changes in the individual. Placebo surgeries have proven successful in our new century. I do believe that we're at a point, and I'll say this as a cautiously hopeful note, where funding will also become more widely available on college campuses and in other professional clinical settings for the study of ESP, or precognition, or retrocognition. Due to the success of polemical critics, a lot of that funding has dried up over the past several decades. But as we're opening to greater and greater questions as to the possibilities of the mind, encompassing not only UFOs and neuroplasticity and placebo studies and string theory, quantum theory, but the new therapeutic uses of entheogens, psilocybin, psychedelics, microdosing. As we're seeing all this open up, I think we are going to be perched on a precipice of new possibilities in ESP, or psychical related research. A psychologist at Cornell University in 2011, Darrell Bem, released a very important paper in which he had provided statistical evidence for what he regarded as either precognition or retrocausality, in which events in the future, sometimes involving memory exercises, affected subjects' abilities in the present. And this now goes back over a decade, just over a decade, and Bem's critics were vociferous and rushed into print papers in which they declared his results couldn't be replicated, the gold standard of science. Well, according to a 2020 paper, it was updated as recently as July 2020, not only have Bem's precognition results been replicated, but they have been replicated 90 times in 33 labs in 14 countries. 90 times in 33 labs in 14 countries. Bem, to his credit, made all of his material available, opened the file drawer, so to speak, so as to bring complete and total transparency to all of his test sets, subject responses, and methodology. He made all of this, including the software that he used to gather his testing results, freely available to everyone, supporter, skeptic, critic, you name it. And this is in an underfunded field. And having done so, his experiments, including the original ones, have been replicated 90 times internationally. This subject matter is not going to go away. We no longer live in an age where it's sufficient to say, I'm not going to look through Galileo's telescope. Look through it or not, there it is. And it points to, the queries of our era point to, an expanded conception of who you are as an individual, an expanded conception of the nature and causative qualities, cosmological experiences, and potential infinitude of your psyche. So, as we approach 2022, are we entering a new era of esoteric and occult inquiry, of spiritual, which is to say extra-physical inquiry that goes beyond any doctrine, dogma, structured belief system? I believe the answer is yes. And I believe the answer is yes because our questions over the course of decades, through periods that have been both friendly and hostile to the search in different parts of the world, our questions have proven indestructible. Maybe the one thing that is indestructible is a question. And our questions have brought us to this place where these doors of perception maybe a little more cleansed than they have been in past years. And we have a very long way to go. Ours is a generation, perhaps, that just stands on a precipice. But having cleansed those doors of perception just a bit, we see the luminosity that is shining through. We see the potential that is shining through, which, as William Blake assessed, is infinite. So I invite you all, seeker to seeker, to watch very carefully for the immediately unfolding events in our worlds and in our lives. I do believe that we are all together on the threshold of a new era of awareness and possibility. The dead ends are there. The switchbacks are present. The dangers of human foibles and foolishness and of myriad social factors are seismic. But the question, who am I, is indestructible. And I think it's one that we are all about to embark on a deepening of together. And I thank you very, very much and wish you every good thing.